Welcome to Brew Cheese, where we brew up the finest of cheese. I'm Micah, and thanks for tuning in. If you're new to our channel, we brew up commander decks on a $50 budget, often with an unexpected twist. I hope you enjoyed that new, more snappy intro. Improvements like that are thanks to your feedback, so definitely keep them coming. The commander over this deck is Ormos, Archive Keeper. Or is it? Ormos is 4 blue for a 5/5 Sphinx with flying, as Sphinxes do, and if you try to draw from an empty library while you have it out, instead of losing, you'll put 5+1/+1 counters on it. You can pay 1 blue and discard 3 cards with different names to draw 5 cards. This means that if you have the cards to discard and an empty library, you get to pile 25 counters on this sucker? Wow. That's certainly an option, but it's not the direction we're trying to go. If you read the video thumbnail, or just picked up on my not-so-subtle hints, you know we're really using a secret commander with Apprentice, all-seeing. It's 3 and triple blue for a 4/5 Sphinx, also with flying, and you can pay 2 and a blue and tap it to draw 2 and discard 1. When it deals damage to an opponent, we can reveal a hand containing at least 6 different CMCs, and if we do, that player loses the game. The beauty in pairing these two is that Apprentice's loot ability kinda sucks compared to Ormos's. Same cost, but Apprentice only digs 2 cards down and requires tapping, while Ormos is reusable so long as we have mana and cards to pitch, and it goes 5 cards deep per activation, letting us both build our dream hand and fish for Apprentice. So what's the overall strategy? We're going to dig for Apprentice and the tools to make it unblockable and to protect it, all while building a hand with 6 different CMCs. We've built the deck with a variety of CMCs and our mana base with as many differently named lands as possible to ensure that we have the best chance of pulling off both commanders' abilities. And if Apprentice is removed, we have a number of backup plans to still pull off a victory. We'll start off with the ramp, as usual, except this time we've gone a little overboard, with 12 sources of ramp. After all, we have a 6 CMC commander to get out, and once we have that out, we can toss any excess ramp pieces to its ability. The first up is Dreamscape Artist. This lets us turn cards in our hand into heroes, allowing us to pay 2 and a blue, tap and discard a card to sack a land and go get 2 more out of our deck and put them into play. This helps to ramp us and also thins basic lands out of our deck, since those run counterpoint to Ormos' requirement to discard differently named cards. For similar reasons, we're running Burnished Heart, which for 2 easy payments of 3 mana, put 2 tapped basics into play from our library. Walking Atlas, we can tap to put out an extra land from our hand. Since our game plan involves so much card draw, it's a natural fit. Star Compass taps for blue once we have an island out, while Silver Mirror taps for a blue all on its own. Prismatic Lens produces colorless or blue if we pay 1 into it and tap it. And then Sea Scryer is pretty much the same thing, just in creature form. Apprentice Wizard can turn a single blue mana investment into 3 colorless. Hedron Crawler and Mannequin Skywalker produce colorless, while Palladium Mirror produces 2 colorless for only 3 mana, which is a pretty great rate. Finally, Pyramid of the Pantheon helps fill that critical 1 CMC slot, but is a decent mana rock on its own. For 2 mana and a tap, it produces blue, and once we've activated that first ability 3 times, it taps for 3 blue on its own, sort of like a Gilded Lotus with a payment plan. Our draw package is fairly minimal, since our commander has such a great draw ability already tacked onto it. But there's a few enhancements to our draw that we really can't ignore. The first such is Teferi's Ageless Insight, which draws us an extra card every time we draw except our first draw on our turn. This turns our commander's draw ability into a whopping 10 cards. Bag of Holding is a bit of a risk with some of our backup plans, but what a payoff it is. Every time we discard those 3 cards for our commander, we put it in the bag. Then whenever we're ready for it, for 4 mana, tap and sack, we put all of the accumulated cards back in our hand. Archmage Ascension gets a quest counter on each end step if we drew 2 or more cards, and once it has 6 of those counters, we can replace any of our draws with a tutor. being able to pay 3 and discard 3 in order to tutor up any 5 cards we want, I'll gladly take that. Plus, if you activate Ormos' ability on each player's turn, you can get the quest counters up even faster, since it's on each end step. Treasure Cruise, in addition to being 8 CMC, we can cast for just 1 mana, so long as we have 7 cards to exile from our graveyard. It of course draws us 3 cards. Before I cover some of the cards that help us out with digging through our deck, one of our game plans is to keep as many cards in hand as possible, so that we have the best shot at 6 different CMCs, and we always have things like counter spells in hand to protect our game plan. Spellbook, Library of Ling, and Graceful Adept all remove our max hand size, with Library of Ling giving us the option to put our discarded cards back on top of our library. Folio of Fancies gives everyone no max hand size, and is actually one of our backup win conditions. More on that later. It lets us pay double X and tap to have each player draw X cards, or for 2 blue and tap, each opponent mills cards equal to the number of cards in their hand. In order to help us find the tools that we need faster, we have a few cards that can help rearrange or even draw our libraries. The first of these is Descendant of Soramaru, a creature that lets us pay 1 and a blue to look at and rearrange the top X cards of our library, where that's how many cards are in our hand. Even without a no max hand size card, getting to rearrange any of our top cards is an amazing ability. Jushi Apprentice here allows us to pay 3 and tap to draw a card. Then, if we have 9 or more cards in hand, it flips into Tomoya the Reveler, which we can pay 3 blue into and tap, and target player draws X cards, where that's the number of cards in our hand. Not only useful when we want to double the number of cards in hand, but also a powerful way to mill someone out when we're holding most of our library in our hand. Tomorrow Azami's Familiar allows us to convert draw into a selection of our top 3 cards. Tomorrow serves a number of roles in the deck. At its most basic, it's 6 CMC, so that helps with Attempts' ability. It substitutes all of Ormos' 5 draws into digging 15 cards deep for what we need, and should Ormos get removed while our library is empty, we don't die from drawing from an empty library, since Tomorrow substitutes that draw. Finally, Curator of Mysteries allows us to scry whenever we discard. Unfortunately, that scry only happens after we draw the 5 cards from Ormos, but it does set up the next few draws after. So we have Attempts out, and we have a straight flush in our hand. We still need to ensure 2 things: that it can get through to our opponents, and that we can protect it. For the first goal, we're including Aqueous Form. Not only is it 1 CMC if we need that, but it can also make Attempts or any of our B team unblockable while providing additional scrying. Prowler's Helm makes the equipped creature blockable only by walls. Fun fact, did you know there's only 16 walls in all of Magic that have flying, and 6 with reach, and only a handful of those see any commander play? Just thought you'd find that interesting. Key to the City also makes a creature unblockable, and cycles through our deck a little bit in the process, letting us discard and tap to ensure it gets through, and giving us the option to pay when it untaps to draw a replacement. Skyblinder Staff makes the equipped creature unblockable by flying creatures, meaning Attempts is only blockable by things with reach. Finally, Whisper Silk Cloak bridges both worlds, making it unblockable and giving it Shroud. I should probably take a moment here to address something when it comes to Attempts, something that comes up if you look that commander up on EDH Rec. A lot of people go with auras like Hermetic Study to give Attempts the ability to just tap to deal damage rather than risk putting it into combat, but we can't always rely on Attempts being there. Some of the backup win cons do need to swing in, which is why we're using unblockability stuff. To protect our win con, we're also using Nurok Stealth Suit, something that all decks running blue should probably be using. It gives the equipped creature Shroud, and it can be equipped for 1, but it also allows us to equip it to a creature at instant speed for 2 blue, making it almost always like having a counter spell when something of yours is being targeted. Alexi's Cloak is an aura with flash, and it grants Shroud. Great for use as a surprise in response to an attempt to remove something, or playable anytime if we want opponents to point any of their removal elsewhere. Mirror Shield gives the equipped creature a slight toughness bump, hexproof, and additional protection against death touch creatures. Of course, one of the best protections we have is just outright countering anything that threatens our position. For that, we're using Stubborn Denial, a 1 CMC instant that counters a non-creature spell unless they pay 1. But if we have a creature with power 4 or more out, which is a lot of the creatures in our deck, it outright counters the spell. Dispel, also at 1 CMC, counters another instant, which is often going to be the most problematic spell type for us. Negate counters any non-creature spell, which Unwind also does, while also giving us an instant rebate. Mana Leak counters unless they can pay 3, something that seems like opponents can do easily in a format that emphasizes access to lots of mana, but you'd be surprised how often this is successful. Lofty Denial also counters unless they pay 1, but that goes up to 4 if you have a flyer. Arcane Denial counters a spell, although it's going to give the caster 2 replacement cards, and you another card to replace Denial. It's embarrassing when you have to do it, but you can totally Arcane Deny your own spell in exchange for drawing 3. Finally, Sinister Sabotage counters a spell and surveils for us, allowing us to dig another card in the process. I keep mentioning our Plan B, and by now you might be wondering who the understudies are for Apprentice. The roster there starts with Kefnet the Mindful, a 5/5 flying indestructible creature that can only do creature things if we have a full hand. It does allow us to draw a card for 4 mana if we need that, and lets us return a land to our hand. There's a few lands we're running with ETB effects, so that's not really a bad deal. Oneirophage flies and gets bigger with every card we draw, making it a pretty formidable threat really fast. Sturmgeist also has flying and gets bigger the more cards we have in hand, and we get to draw whenever it hits someone. Psychosis Crawler also has PT equal to our hand size, but more valuable is its ability to ping all of our opponents for 1 every time we draw. Ominous Seas gets a foreshadow counter every time we draw, and we can cash in 8 of those to make an 8/8 Kraken, and this effect is totally repeatable, popping out another Kraken every time we get 8 more counters. And finally, there's the reset button that is Elixir of Immortality, shuffling itself in our graveyard back into our library. We'll want to reserve this for the situation where we have no real win cons and we need to get everything back, or if we have an empty library and Ormos gets removed, something like that. It's worth mentioning that it's also 1 CMC. One secret ace up our sleeve is an easy infinite mana combo, Grand Architect and Pilipala. With these 2 out, you activate the Architect's second ability to make Pilipala blue. Then, use Architect's third ability to tap Pilipala for 2 colorless. Then, use that same 2 colorless to activate Pilipala's ability to untap itself to produce blue. This can be repeated infinitely, giving us infinite blue mana. What can this deck do with infinite blue mana? Ormos' ability is repeatable, letting us pitch any 3 cards we don't want for 5 more, giving a really high chance of being able to build a dream hand. Moreover, this lets us draw our entire library and craft the hand we want. We can pump that mana into Folio of Fancy's second ability, drawing all players infinite cards. Because Ormos' Labman-esque ability protects us from drawing an empty library, we instantly win the game. Then there's Capsize, which can be cast for 3 and then bought back for 3 infinitely, bouncing everyone else's lands and other permanents back to their hand, making it a super cyclonic rift. Needless to say, Capsize is one of our removal spells. We're also running Blink of an Eye and Into the Royal, both of which bounce a non-land permanent for 2 and have a 2 mana kicker cost that draws us a card if we want to pay it. Boomerang bounces any permanent back to its owner's hand, which bouncing lands comes up as useful a lot, more than one would think. Take Maze of Ith for example, something that would be a nightmare for us. Plus, if we have infinite mana, we have the option of endlessly drawing all of our deck, casting Boomerang on something, using Elixir of Immortality to shuffle back our graveyard, and doing it all again, letting us also bounce everything, kind of like we do with Capsize. Expel from Erazka bounces non-land permanents, except if we have 10 or more permanents, it goes on top of the owner's library instead. Curse of the Swine exiles X target creatures, something that's also pretty nice with infinite mana. For each of those creatures, we give them a vanilla 2/2 in its place. Reality Shift exiles a creature and has the owner manifest the top card of their library. It's devious, but we can use the above trick to endlessly loop this and mill everybody else out by repeatedly reality shifting the manifested creature. We have a few board wipes, or what passes for budget board wipes in blue, starting with Etherize, which returns all attacking creatures back to their owner's hands. River's Rebuke bounces the creatures controlled by one player back to their hand, and Washout lets us pick a color and bounce everything that's that color. Granted, this is probably only going to hit one opponent, possibly two, and we really don't want to pick blue. This may all seem limiting, but I've never regretted casting this. Finally, there's Flood of Tears, which bounces all non-land permanents, and if we had 4 or more permanents returned, we get to replay something for free. There's one more card before we get to the lands that didn't quite fit in anywhere, but it was just too good not to include, and that's Mist of Stagnation. This enchantment makes it so that permanents don't untap, and players get to untap one permanent on their upkeep for each card in their graveyard. Although this won't be super effective if our opponents have racked up any sizable graveyard, in which case it can be tossed, but a lot of the time it will not at all punish us while restricting opponents heavily. A note on our land choices. As I mentioned in the deck strategy, we're running a lot of non-basic lands to help ensure that we have easy access to 3 differently named cards to toss. So we'll start with Halimar Depths, which lets us rearrange the top 3 cards of our library and produces blue. Castle Vantress also produces blue, and we can pay 4 into it and tap it to scry 2. Zalfran Void scries for 1 when it enters, and it taps for colorless. Desert of the Mindful, Lonely Sandbar, and Remote Isle can all be cycled away to help accelerate our fishing, and speaking of fishing, they also tap for that water mana. Drownyard Temple represents some additional hidden ramp in our deck. We can discard this with Ormos' ability, and then pay 3 to put it straight onto the battlefield, giving us an extra land. Myriad Landscape taps for colorless, but we're probably more interested in its ability to be sacked for 2 to go fetch out 2 islands, thus ramping us slightly and thinning our deck of basic islands. Temple of the False God produces 2 colorless so long as we have 5 or more lands. As it turns out, the Temple is only a bad play 1 in about every 6 games, which we know thanks to an analysis posted on Reddit, which I'll link in the comments. Even in those occasional games, it can still be enabled by the next turn if there's a land drop, so it's really only bad if we don't have reliable access to land drops. Considering Ormos' ability, we'll have that in spades. Bonder's Enclave produces colorless, and lets us pay 3 and tap it to draw a card if we have a creature with power 4 or greater. I know we already have plenty of better card draw, but we can't always rely on access to it. Hostile Desert taps for colorless, and it also allows us to exile lands from our graveyard after we've pitched them to turn it into a 3/4 for the turn. While that's not always the best, it does give us a creature we can access after something like a board wipe. Speaking of deserts, Ipni Rivulet taps for colorless or blue, but only if we pay 1 life for the blue. We can also pay 2, tap, and sack a desert to have a player mill 4. That's not something that'll come up all that often, but this is a cheap land that produces blue and has a different name, so it's going in. Seed of the Synod goes into the deck more or less for the same reason, despite having no artifact synergy. It produces blue, comes in untapped, and has a different name. Mystic Sanctuary produces blue and enters untapped if we have 3 or more other islands. If it does enter untapped, we get to put an instant or sorcery from our graveyard back on top of our library. Rogue's Passage is another tool in the deck to make sure that either a Tempsis or one of our other win cons makes it through unblocked. It does just that if we pay 4 into it and tap it, or it can produce colorless. And then finally we wrap up our lands with 23 islands. I did go with a higher overall land count in the deck for the same reason that there's extra ramp, because we can always pitch excess cards, but we have to get to 6 mana to really get the engine started, so reliable access to mana was paramount. The total cost for this deck came up to $47.79. These prices are powered by TCG Player, not a sponsor, using optimized pricing. The total does include shipping and allows for cards of any condition. Thank you for watching, and if you like what we're doing here, subscribe or share this video with a friend. or leave a comment telling us what we missed or what you'd like to see in the future. See you again next video.